Hi, I'm Sarah. At my sister's wedding, they handed me valet keys and told me to park cars like hired help because someone needs to do the grunt work. When I drove off in the bride's Rolls-Royce at the end of the night, leaving them stranded at their own reception, my sister screamed, "You destroyed everything!" That moment didn't just end a wedding. It ended 28 years of me being treated like the family's personal servant instead of the daughter who served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Ever wonder what happens when the one they've always walked over finally stops bending? Before we dive in, what time are you watching this, and where from? Drop a comment. I want to know who else out there has ever been told their military service means nothing compared to someone else's Pinterest wedding dreams. I showed up in my dress blues, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because it was the only formal outfit I owned that still fit properly. 3 years out of the Army and I was still adjusting to civilian life, still learning how to exist in a world where people complained about traffic instead of roadside bombs. The wedding was at Grandview Estate, one of those sprawling properties with marble columns and topiary gardens that cost more per hour than I made in a month at my security job downtown. My sister Melissa had been planning this day since she was 12, collecting magazine clippings and Pinterest boards like some people collect stamps. The parking lot was already full of luxury cars when I arrived. Bentleys, Mercedes, a few Teslas scattered around like expensive confetti. I walked past them all, my military-issued dress shoes clicking against the asphalt in a rhythm that reminded me of formation marching. Inside, the reception hall glittered under crystal chandeliers, each table draped in ivory silk with centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Melissa stood near the altar area in her custom gown, surrounded by bridesmaids in matching lavender dresses, all of them squealing over details I couldn't pretend to care about. My mother spotted me from across the room and glided over, her champagne-colored dress shimmering with each step. She wore the smile she reserved for church functions and PTA meetings, bright, practiced, and completely hollow. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice dripping with that particular sweetness that always preceded a request I wouldn't like. "You look so military." She said it like it was a disease I hadn't quite recovered from. Bad appeared beside her, adjusting his bow tie nervously. He never knew how to talk to me anymore, not since I came back from my second deployment with a Purple Heart and what the VA doctors politely called adjustment difficulties. To him, I was broken goods. A daughter who'd traded her femininity for fatigues, and came home speaking a language he didn't understand. "Sarah," he nodded, the same greeting he'd given neighbor he barely knew. The ceremony itself was a blur of organ music and vows that sounded like they'd been copied from a romance novel. I sat in the third row, behind cousins I hadn't spoken to in years and family friends who remembered me as the one who joined the Army instead of college. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, part of me wanted to stand up and object to the whole charade, not the marriage, but the way they'd turned love into a financial transaction with a 6-figure price tag. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during cocktail hour, I found myself standing alone near the gift table, watching people I'd grown up with pretend they didn't see me. Military service had made me invisible in a different way than before, not just overlooked, but actively avoided, like trauma was contagious. I sipped my water and observed the way they'd trained me in reconnaissance. I watched my sister pose for endless photos, my mother orchestrated conversations like a social conductor, and my father shook hands with men who owned car dealerships and investment firms. That's when my mother approached me again, this time with Uncle Pete trailing behind her. Pete owned a construction company and had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "Sarah," Mom said, her voice taking on that particular tone that meant she was about to ask for something disgusting. "We have a tiny little favor to ask. The valet service is running behind, and we've got all these important guests arriving. Would you mind terribly helping out with parking? You're so good with cars, and honestly, you're not really mingling anyway." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You want me to work the valet at my sister's wedding?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "As a guest, not as hired help, but as family?" Uncle Pete jumped in with his practiced salesman smile. It's just temporary, kiddo. An hour or two max. Someone needs to handle luxury vehicles, and, let's face it, you've got the discipline for it. Military training, right? He laughed like he'd made a joke instead of an insult. My mother's expression hardened when she realized I wasn't immediately agreeing. Sarah, this family has supported you through everything. The least you can do is help make your sister's day perfect. It's not asking much. Her voice carried that familiar edge, the one that had been there since I came home from Afghanistan, with nightmares and a tendency to jump at loud noises. I looked around the room, at the sea of relatives and family friends, all of them watching this interaction with the kind of fascination people reserve for car accidents. My sister caught my eye from across the room, surrounded by her bridesmaids, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not embarrassment, but satisfaction. She wanted this. She wanted me relegated to servant status on her perfect day. The red valet jacket they handed me was polyester and scratchy against my skin. It hung loose on my frame, designed for someone broader and shorter than my military-honed build. The bow tie was clip-on, the kind worn by teenage grocery store employees, and it sat crooked no matter how I adjusted it. I stood at the entrance to Grandview Estate, watching expensive cars glide up the circular drive like metallic sharks, the kind. Each key handoff was a small humiliation. Careful with the paint, they'd say, or don't adjust the mirrors. As if my military training hadn't included operating vehicles worth more than most people's houses. As if I hadn't driven armored trucks through hostile territory while people shot at me. But here I was, smiling politely and jogging toward parking spots like a teenager with a summer job. The other valets were actual employees, college kids earning weekend cash, retirees picking up extra income. They looked at me with confusion when I introduced myself. "Your family?" one asked. "Why are you working?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane. Growing up, I was always the daughter who didn't quite fit the mold my parents had designed. While Melissa learned piano and took ballet classes, I was in the backyard taking apart lawnmower engines and teaching myself to change oil. When she won Homecoming Queen, I was captain of the debate team and varsity track. When she got accepted to State University with a communications major, I was already talking to Army recruiters about serving my country. The pattern was always the same. Melissa got the applause, and I got the responsibility. Our house on Maple Street was the kind of suburban dream that looked perfect from the outside. Two-story colonial with a wraparound porch, meticulously maintained flower beds, and a 3-car garage that housed Dad's boat alongside the family vehicles. But inside those walls, there was an unspoken hierarchy that placed Melissa at the top and me somewhere near the bottom, useful for heavy lifting and problem-solving, but never quite worthy of the same consideration. I spent my childhood being the reliable one. When Melissa forgot her lunch money, I gave her mine. When she crashed Dad's car senior year, I took the blame because Sarah can handle consequences better. When she needed help with math homework, I spent hours explaining concepts that came naturally to me but seemed impossible for her to grasp. My parents praised her effort and took my competence for granted, as if intelligence and responsibility were somehow less valuable than charm and social grace. The military recruiter who visited our high school during my junior year saw something in me that my family never had. Staff Sergeant Martinez looked at my grades, my athletic achievements, my volunteer work at the Veterans Home, and said something that changed my life. "You've got leadership written all over you, Rodriguez. Ever think about serving something bigger than yourself?" For the first time in 17 years, someone saw potential in me instead of just utility. My parents' reaction to my enlistment was exactly what I expected. Mom cried. Not proud tears, but disappointed ones, as if I'd announced I was dropping out of school to join a circus. Dad sat in his recliner, staring at the paperwork I'd brought home, shaking his head like I'd personally insulted him. "College is where smart girls go, Sarah," he said finally. "The military is for kids who don't have other options." But I did have other options. I had a full academic scholarship to 3 different universities. I had job offers from local businesses who knew my work ethic. I had every advantage a middle-class kid could want. except the one thing I craved most: respect. The Army promised to judge me on my merit, my performance, my dedication. It promised that hard work would be rewarded instead of expected and then dismissed. Melissa's reaction was the most telling of all. While our parents worried about my safety and my future, she seemed relieved that I wouldn't be around to overshadow her anymore. No more sister, who got better grades without trying, who could fix anything that broke, who coaches and teachers always held up as an example. With me gone, she could finally be the successful daughter without competition. Basic training at Fort Benning was the first place I'd ever been, where being tough was an asset instead of a liability. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, I thrived. The drill sergeants noticed my natural leadership abilities and recommended me for advanced training. By the time I graduated, I'd earned the respect of my peers and superiors alike, something I'd never experienced in civilian life. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 18 months after enlistment. I was a communications specialist attached to a forward operating base near Kandahar, responsible for maintaining critical radio and satellite links between combat units and command. The work was demanding, dangerous, and absolutely vital to mission success. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just useful, I was essential. The letters from home during that first deployment painted a picture of life continuing exactly as it had before I left. Melissa had joined a sorority, was dating a pre-med student, and had already started talking about wedding plans. Mom sent care packages filled with cookies and magazines, but never asked about my work or my experiences. Dad's letters were brief updates about his golf handicap and the weather, as if I was at summer camp instead of a war zone. When I came home for my first leave, the disconnect was jarring. My family wanted to hear war stories, but only the sanitized, Hollywood versions. They didn't want to know about the IED that destroyed our convoy's lead vehicle, or the rocket attack that left me with temporary hearing loss and a Purple Heart. They wanted me to be the same Sarah who'd left, just with some interesting stories to tell at dinner parties. Melissa had announced her engagement while I was overseas, sending me a text message with a photo of her ring. No phone call, no personal note, just a group text that went out to dozens of people simultaneously. When I called to congratulate her, she spent 5 minutes describing the proposal, and then asked if I thought I'd be able to get leave for the wedding. Not when I was coming home, not how I was doing, but whether I'd be available to attend her special day. The second deployment was harder. By then, I understood that my family had moved on without me, that my absence had been filled not with concern or pride, but with relief. They could function perfectly well without the daughter who asked too many questions and expected too much credit for her contributions. Melissa's wedding planning kicked into high gear while I was dodging mortar attacks and maintaining communication networks that kept soldiers alive. My transition back to civilian life 3 years ago had been brutal. The VA counselors called it adjustment disorder, but what they really meant was that I'd learned to value myself in a place where courage and competence mattered. And now I had to readjust to a world where my family still saw me as the backup daughter. I found work with a private security firm, decent pay, but nothing like the sense of purpose I'd had in the military. The wedding preparations had dominated every family gathering for the past year. Melissa's engagement party, her bridal shower, the rehearsal dinner, all events where I was expected to attend, contribute financially, and smile while being treated like hired help rather than immediate family. I'd watched my parents spend more on her wedding dress than I made in 6 months, while constantly being reminded that military benefits meant I was somehow better equipped to handle financial stress than everyone else. Standing there in that polyester valet jacket, watching luxury cars arrive for my sister's fairy tale wedding, I finally understood my place in this family's hierarchy. I wasn't the daughter who'd served her country with honor. I wasn't the sister who'd sacrificed her own plans to support Melissa's dreams. I was just another employee, expected to work without complaint while the real family enjoyed the celebration. The pressure campaign began subtly, the way most family manipulation does, wrapped in concern and packaged as reasonable requests. 3 weeks before the wedding, Mom called while I was getting ready for work, her voice carrying that particular brightness she used when she wanted something significant. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about your role in the wedding," she said, as if my role hadn't already been established months ago as guest who writes checks. "I thought we already discussed this," I replied, pulling on my security company uniform. "I'm attending as a family, period." Her laugh was hollow, the kind that preceded negotiations I never agreed to participate in. "Well, that's what we wanted to talk about. Melissa's been stressed about logistics, and we thought maybe you could help coordinate some of the vendor management. Use those organizational skills the Army taught you. Vendor management." As if my military experience qualified me to be an unpaid wedding coordinator for a celebration that had already consumed my entire savings in gift contributions and outfit expenses. "Mom, I work 6 days a week. I don't have time to manage Melissa's vendors." "It's not managing, exactly," she said, her tone shifting to the patient voice she used with unreasonable children. "More like quality control. Making sure everything runs smoothly. You're so good at spotting problems before they happen." The conversation ended with me agreeing to think about it, which in family code meant they'd wear me down over the next few weeks until I capitulated. And they did. Systematically and relentlessly. Dad called 2 days later with concerns about security at the venue. "These are expensive cars, Sarah. Important people. Someone with your training should really oversee the parking situation." Melissa herself joined the campaign a week before the wedding, showing up at my apartment unannounced with tears in her eyes, and a story about how the hired help was unreliable. "I just need someone I trust watching over things," she said, sitting on my couch in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. "You're the only person who actually cares about details." "Hire better vendors," I suggested, but she was already shaking her head. "We can't change anything now. Everything's booked, everything's paid for. I just need family support." The way she said family support made it sound like a moral obligation, as if refusing to work at her wedding would somehow violate the sister code. Uncle Pete appeared at my workplace the following Thursday, striding into the security office like he owned the building. "Sarah, there she is, our little soldier." He'd never called me that when I was actually deployed, but apparently civilian life had made my service more palatable. "I hear you're helping out with the wedding operations." "I haven't agreed to anything," I said, looking up from the shift schedules I was reviewing. He sat down across from my desk without invitation, his presence filling the small office with expensive cologne and entitlement. "Look, kiddo, I've been in business long enough to know talent when I see it. Melissa's got herself a hell of a wedding planned, but planning and executing are two different animals. She needs someone with command experience. She needs professional event staff, not free family labor." "This isn't about free labor," he said, leaning forward with his salesman's intensity. "This is about family legacy. This wedding is going to be talked about for years. Everyone who matters in this town will be there. Do you want it associated with our family name, or do you want people remembering the day the Rodriguez girls couldn't pull off one perfect event?" The manipulation was so obvious it was almost insulting. Pete had never cared about family legacy before. He'd missed half my high school graduations and both my military ceremonies. But now, suddenly, my competence was essential to the family's reputation. The real escalation came during the rehearsal dinner, held at the country club Dad could barely afford, but insisted on booking because Melissa deserves the best. I sat at the far end of the head table, past the bridesmaids and groomsmen, past Melissa's college friends, squeezed between Aunt Linda and Cousin Mike, who spent the entire meal talking about his boat. After the toast, none of which mentioned my military service or homecoming, Mom stood up with her champagne glass raised. "I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who's made this magical week possible," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "Especially our Sarah, who's volunteered to oversee guest services tomorrow to make sure everything runs perfectly." The applause that followed felt like a trap snapping shut. 60 people now believed I'd volunteered for wedding staff duty. Melissa beamed at me from the bride's table, raising her glass in my direction like I'd just given her the greatest gift imaginable. I sat frozen, understanding that any protest now would make me look petty and selfish in front of the entire wedding party. After dinner, I cornered Mom near the coat check. "You just announced something I never agreed to," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice level. "Oh, honey, don't be dramatic. It's just helping out. Your family. She adjusted her pearls, a nervous habit that surfaced whenever she was caught in manipulation. Besides, everyone knows you're the responsible one. Melissa couldn't possibly manage all those details on her wedding day. Then hire professionals. We have hired professionals. We just need someone to coordinate with them, someone who speaks the language. She meant military language, as if my service had been 8 years of event planning training instead of communications and combat operations. Dad joined us, his face flushed from the open bar. Sarah, your mother tells me you're having second thoughts about helping tomorrow. I never had first thoughts about it. You volunteered me without asking. His expression hardened, the look he'd worn throughout my childhood whenever I questioned family decisions. This is what families do, Sarah. We support each other. When Melissa needed help with college tuition, did we hesitate? When she needed co-signers for her apartment, did we make excuses? The comparison was perfect manipulation, reminding me of all the times they'd supported Melissa, while implying that my reluctance to work her wedding somehow made me ungrateful. Never mind that I'd never asked for college tuition help because I'd earned my own through military service. Never mind that I'd been living independently since enlistment, while Melissa had remained financially dependent well into her 20s. This isn't the same thing, I said, but I could hear my resolve weakening. Isn't it? Mom asked, moving closer with her predatory smile. Family means sacrifice, Sarah. It means putting others first sometimes. Tomorrow is Melissa's day. Her one special day. Are you really going to make it about your pride? The conversation ended with me standing alone in the country club parking lot, staring at my reflection in the window of my 10-year-old Honda Civic. Around me, luxury vehicles gleamed under the streetlights. BMWs and Mercedes belonging to Melissa's new in-laws and their affluent friends. Tomorrow, I'd be expected to park those cars, to serve those people, to smile and nod while being treated like hired help at my own sister's wedding. I drove home that night with the radio off, needing silence to process what had just happened. They'd maneuvered me into a corner so expertly I'd barely seen it coming. Every family obligation, every shared memory, every moment of supposed love had been weaponized to make me complicit in my own humiliation. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that photographers pray for and brides consider a blessing from above. I stood in my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., staring at my reflection while trying to convince myself that this day would end without bloodshed, metaphorically speaking. The red valet jacket hung on my closet door like a scarlet letter, a symbol of everything wrong with my place in this family's ecosystem. By 8 a.m., I was at Grandview Estate, watching actual professional valets set up their station with military precision that I couldn't help but appreciate. They had matching uniforms, proper clipboards, and a system for tracking keys that would make a quartermaster proud. I introduced myself to their supervisor, Carlos, who looked at me with the confusion I'd grown accustomed to over the past week. "You're working today?" he asked, glancing at the family photo prominently displayed on the welcome table, where I stood in my dress blues next to Melissa in her engagement photos. "I thought you were the sister." "I am the sister," I replied, adjusting the polyester jacket that felt like wearing shame. "Apparently that means I'm also quality control today." The guests began arriving around 10 a.m. for the 11 o'clock ceremony, and I found myself directing traffic with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of military training. Mercedes after BMW after Lexus, each one handed over with instructions about scratch sensitivity and mirror positions. The owners barely looked at me. To them, I was just another service worker, invisible and interchangeable. Judge Phillips arrived in a gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom, the kind of vehicle that costs more than most people's houses. He was one of Dad's golf buddies, a man who'd never missed an opportunity to remind our family that he'd made something of himself, despite growing up in the same modest neighborhood we had. He stepped out of the driver's seat like he was emerging from a royal carriage, straightening his platinum cufflinks and adjusting his Rolex. "Careful with her, young lady," he said, dropping the keys into my palm without making eye contact. "She's worth more than you'll make in 5 years." I wanted to tell him that I'd driven vehicles worth 10 times that through minefields in Afghanistan, But instead, I smiled and nodded like a good little servant. Of course, sir. I'll take excellent care of it. The ceremony itself was everything Melissa had dreamed of. Flower petals floating in the air, string quartet music that sounded like angels weeping, and enough white silk to outfit a small army. I watched from the parking area through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the reception hall, seeing my family play their roles in this elaborate theater production. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Dad stood proud and paternal, and Melissa glowed like she'd been lit from within. Or should have been inside. I should have been in the second row, wearing my good dress and dabbing at my own eyes as my sister promised to love and honor the man she'd chosen. Instead, I was outside in a polyester jacket, making sure Judge Phillips' precious Rolls didn't get bird droppings on its pristine paint job. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, guests flowing from the chapel to the main ballroom like a river of expensive fabric and jewelry. I was stationed at the valet stand, officially off-duty but expected to remain available for emergencies, whatever those might be at a wedding reception. Through the windows, I could see the first dance, the cake cutting, the toasts that I should have been part of giving. Around 9 p.m., as the reception wound down and guests began requesting their vehicles, the real humiliation began. Mrs. Worthington, one of Mom's bridge club friends, approached the valet stand with the imperious attitude of someone who'd never worked a day in her life. "Excuse me," she said, snapping her fingers at me like I was a dog. "I need my car immediately. Silver Mercedes, license plate worth one." I located her keys and jogged to retrieve her vehicle, my dress shoes clicking against the asphalt, in a rhythm that reminded me of formation marching. When I returned with her Mercedes, she was standing with 2 other society women, all of them watching me with the kind of amusement people reserve for trained animals performing tricks. "Isn't that the bride's sister?" one of them whispered, not quietly enough. "The military one?" Mrs. Worthington replied, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "How wonderful that she's found work that suits her skill set." They laughed. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but the kind of casual dismissal that cuts deeper than outright insults. To them, I wasn't a veteran who'd served her country with honor. I wasn't a woman who'd earned medals for valor under fire. I was just the bride's unfortunate sister, the one who couldn't quite fit into polite society and had to settle for manual labor. The breaking point came at 10:30, when the reception was officially ending and guests were calling for their cars in greater numbers. I'd been on my feet for 12 hours, had skipped both lunch and dinner, and was running on nothing but coffee and stubborn pride. Judge Phillips appeared at the valet stand, his face flushed from champagne and his bow tie askew. "Where's my Rolls?" he demanded, as if I'd personally misplaced it rather than parked it safely in the VIP section. "I'll get it right away, sir," I replied, but he was already launching into a lecture about responsibility and proper care of expensive vehicles. "Do you have any idea what that car is worth?" he continued, his voice rising loud enough to attract attention from nearby guests. "It's not some army jeep you can throw around like a toy." The comparison hit like a physical blow. Army jeep. As if my military service was somehow less valuable than his luxury car. As if the vehicles I'd driven through combat zones were toys compared to his status symbol. Around us, guests had stopped their conversations to watch the show, my family included. That's when I saw them, Mom, Dad, and Melissa standing near the reception hall entrance, all of them watching this public dressing down with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to satisfaction. None of them moved to intervene. None of them said a word in my defense. They just stood there, letting Judge Phillips humiliate their daughter and sister in front of the entire wedding party. "Sarah Rodriguez," he continued, reading my name tag like it was evidence of my inadequacy. "I hope you understand the responsibility you've been given here. This isn't child's play." My vision tunneled, the way it had during firefights in Afghanistan when everything except the immediate threat faded into background noise. Around me, the wedding guests had formed a loose circle, watching this entertainment with the kind of fascination people have for car accidents. My family remained frozen in place, unwilling to defend me but unable to look away. Judge Phillips held out his hand expectantly, waiting for me to sprint to his precious car like an obedient servant. The keys to the Rolls-Royce felt heavy in my palm, heavier than they should have for such small pieces of metal. Behind him, I could see Melissa's face clearly now, Not embarrassed by my treatment, but annoyed that this scene was happening at her perfect wedding. That look, that expression of irritation at my existence rather than outrage at my humiliation, was the moment everything crystallized. I wasn't family to these people. I was a problem to be managed, a source of labor to be exploited, an embarrassment to be hidden away when convenient and dragged out when useful. I smiled then, the same calm smile I'd learned to wear in hostile territory when making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Judge Phillips misinterpreted my expression as compliance, his own face relaxing into smug satisfaction as he waited for me to fetch his car like a good little soldier. Instead, I turned and walked toward the parking area, my back straight and my pace deliberate, while behind me the whispers began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. The walk to the VIP parking section felt like moving through water, each step deliberate and measured, while my mind processed what had just happened with the kind of tactical clarity that comes from years of military training. The Rolls-Royce sat under the amber security lights like a sleeping predator, its black paint gleaming despite the evening dew. I stood beside it for a moment, keys in my hand, listening to the distant sounds of the reception winding down and thinking about dignity, what it meant, what it cost, and what happened when you finally decided it was worth more than keeping the peace. I didn't get in the car immediately. Instead, I opened the trunk and carefully removed my small overnight bag, the one I'd packed that morning in case I needed to leave quickly. Military training teaches you to always have an exit strategy, and tonight had proven that wisdom correct. I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked back toward the reception hall, my footsteps echoing off the marble steps as I climbed toward the entrance. Inside, the cleanup was already beginning. Caterers moved efficiently through the ballroom, clearing champagne glasses and folding linens with practiced precision. The wedding party lingered near the gift table, taking photos and saying final goodbyes to guests who were trickling out in small groups. I spotted my parents near the main entrance, my mother still glowing with satisfaction from her perfect daughter's perfect day. "Sarah," Mom called when she saw me approaching. "Did you find Judge Phillips's car? He seemed quite concerned about—" "We need to talk," I interrupted, my voice carrying the kind of authority that made her mouth snap shut mid-sentence. "All of us. Now." Dad appeared beside her, his face still flushed from celebration and alcohol. "Sarah, this isn't the time for family meetings. It's been a long day and—" "It has been a long day," I agreed, setting my overnight bag down beside me. 12 hours of being treated like hired help at my own sister's wedding. "So yes, let's talk about how long this day has been." Melissa materialized from the crowd of remaining guests, her wedding dress rustling like expensive paper as she moved. Even at the end of the night, she looked perfect. Not a hair out of place, makeup still flawless, radiating the kind of contentment that comes from getting everything you've ever wanted. "Sarah, what's wrong now? Can't this wait until tomorrow?" "No," I said, my voice steady and calm. "It can't wait." We found a quiet corner near the gift table, away from the caterers and remaining guests. I faced my family, my parents standing side by side like a united front, Melissa beside them still clutching her bouquet, and felt something shift inside my chest. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something cleaner and sharper. Clarity. "Do you know what Judge Phillips said to me out there?" I asked, looking directly at my father. "He compared my military service to playing with toy jeeps. He lectured me about responsibility while humiliating me in front of your friends. And you all stood there and watched." Mom's face flushed slightly. "Sarah, honey, Judge Phillips was probably just stressed. You know how particular he is about his car?" "I know exactly how particular he is," I cut her off. "What I don't know is why my own family stood there and let him humiliate their daughter who served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. I don't know why not one of you said a single word in my defense." Dad shifted uncomfortably, his bow tie now completely undone around his neck. "Sarah, you're overreacting. It was just a misunderstanding. Judge Phillips didn't mean anything personal by it." "Didn't he?" I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, where I'd been documenting things throughout the evening. "Let me read you some of the other things I heard tonight. Mrs. Worthington telling her friends that I'd found work that, quote, suits my skill set. Mr. Chen asked if I was getting paid minimum wage or if my family gets a discount. Your golf buddy Rick wondered out loud if this was court-mandated community service. The silence that followed was deafening. Melissa's grip tightened on her bouquet, her knuckles showing white against the silk ribbons. Mom's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. They weren't just insulting me, I continued, my voice gaining strength. They were insulting you, your daughter, your family, and you let them because it was easier than defending the daughter who doesn't fit your perfect suburban image. That's not fair, Melissa said, finally finding her voice. We never asked you to make a scene. We never asked you to turn my wedding into some kind of political statement about your military service. Political statement? I repeated, genuinely amazed. Melissa, asking for basic human dignity isn't political. Expecting your family to treat you like family instead of free labor isn't activism. It's the bare minimum of respect. You volunteered to help, Dad said weakly, but his heart wasn't in the argument anymore. No, I didn't. You volunteered me. You announced at the rehearsal dinner that I'd agreed to work wedding staff without ever asking if I actually wanted to. You manipulated me into a corner and then acted like I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve at my own sister's wedding. I looked at each of them in turn, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. My mother, who'd spent years using my competence against me, making my reliability into a weapon for her convenience. My father, who'd never quite known what to do with a daughter who didn't need his protection or approval. My sister, who'd built her identity around being the princess, while casting me as the servant. I spent 8 years in the military, I said quietly. I earned commendations for leadership under fire. I maintained communication systems that kept soldiers alive. I came home with a Purple Heart and post-traumatic stress disorder. And you know what you saw? You saw free labor. You saw someone you could use without having to pay. Melissa's composure finally cracked. Sarah, you're ruining everything. This was supposed to be perfect. This was supposed to be my day. Your day, I repeated. Your perfect day. Built on my unpaid labor, funded partially by my savings, and celebrated while I stood outside in a polyester jacket, making sure your guests' cars didn't get scratched. The tears started then, but not from me. Melissa began crying the way she had as a child when she didn't get her way. Loud, dramatic sobs, designed to summon immediate sympathy and redirect blame. Mom moved to comfort her immediately, wrapping protective arms around her precious daughter while shooting accusatory looks in my direction. Look what you've done, Mom hissed. On her wedding day, Sarah. How could you be so selfish? And there it was, the word that had defined my place in this family for 28 years. Selfish. As if wanting respect was selfish. As if expecting basic human dignity was asking too much. As if standing up for myself somehow made me the villain in their story. I picked up my overnight bag and slung it over my shoulder, feeling lighter already despite the weight of everything I was carrying. You want to know what selfish looks like? I asked, my voice calm as lake water. Selfish is making your sister work your wedding for free. Selfish is standing by while strangers insult your daughter. Selfish is 28 years of taking everything I give and then calling me ungrateful when I finally stop giving. I turned and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the marble foyer. Behind me, I could hear Melissa's sobs growing louder, Mom's frantic attempts at comfort, and Dad's frustrated muttering about timing and family loyalty. None of them followed me. None of them called my name. I stepped out into the cool evening air and walked purposefully toward the VIP parking section, where Judge Phillips's Rolls-Royce waited like a gleaming symbol of everything wrong with this entire situation. The keys felt warm in my palm as I approached the driver's side door, and for the first time all day, I smiled with genuine anticipation. The discovery began innocently enough the next morning, when I was sitting in my studio apartment drinking coffee and trying to process the previous night's events. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Maria, who lived in Phoenix and had missed the wedding due to work commitments. Call me when you get this, the message read. Found something you need to see. Maria had always been the family truth teller, the one who remembered uncomfortable details that others preferred to forget. When I called her back, her voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard before. "Sarah, I've been going through some old family photos for a scrapbook project, and I found something from Uncle Pete's construction company party last month. You need to see this video." She sent it through email, a 20-second clip filmed on someone's phone during what appeared to be a backyard barbecue. The video quality was shaky, clearly recorded without the subject's knowledge, but the audio was crystal clear. I recognized Uncle Pete's voice immediately, along with my father's distinctive laugh and several other male relatives discussing something with the casual confidence of men who believed they were among friends. "The military thing was smart," Uncle Pete was saying, gesturing with a beer bottle. "Made her independent, gave her that discipline we can use. Sarah's always been the worker bee in that family. Now she's got that soldier mentality, follows orders, doesn't question authority, perfect for handling the grunt work." Dad's voice came next, slurred slightly from alcohol. "Helen's been planning this for months. Get Sarah to handle wedding logistics, security, parking, all the stuff that costs a fortune if you hire professionals. She's got the training for it, and she won't charge family rates." "Brilliant," another voice added. "I thought it might be Cousin Rick. Free military-grade event security. Those rich folks at the wedding will never know they're getting premium service without the premium price tag." The laughter that followed was casual, comfortable, the sound of men congratulating themselves on a clever scheme. But it was Uncle Pete's final comment that made my blood run cold. "The best part is, she'll never figure it out. Sarah's too loyal to family to question why we need her to play servant at her own sister's wedding. The military trained her to follow orders without asking why." I played the video 3 more times, each viewing revealing new layers of calculation and contempt. This hadn't been a last-minute favor request. This had been a planned exploitation, engineered months in advance with military precision that would have impressed my old commanding officers. They'd used my sense of family loyalty as a weapon against me, counting on my training and conditioning to make me compliant. Maria's voice came through the phone speaker, gentle but firm. "Sarah, there's more. I've been talking to Aunt Carmen about some things she noticed at family gatherings. She thinks this isn't the first time." Over the next hour, Maria laid out a pattern I'd been too close to see. My college fund, which had mysteriously been reallocated to help with Melissa's sorority expenses while I was in basic training. The family Christmas gifts I'd been volunteered to coordinate and partially fund every year since my first deployment. The moving expenses for 3 different relatives had somehow become my responsibility, because military people are good at logistics. "They've been using you as their unpaid contractor for years," Maria said bluntly. "Your military salary, your VA benefits, your security clearance connections, everything about your service became a resource they could tap whenever they needed something done or paid for." The evidence was overwhelming once I started looking for it. Text messages between family members discussing my capabilities and availability. Email chains about family events where my name appeared not as a daughter or sister, but as a solution to various logistical problems. Photo albums where I was consistently positioned as the helper in group shots, carrying bags, setting up tables, managing children, while Melissa was always front and center, posed like a princess. I spent the rest of that day making phone calls, reaching out to extended family members and family friends who'd witnessed years of these dynamics without comment. Aunt Carmen confirmed that she'd heard Mom and Melissa planning the wedding work assignment during Easter dinner, laughing about how Sarah will never say no to family. Cousin David admitted he'd always wondered why I was the only one expected to contribute both money and labor to family events, while others just showed up as guests. The most damaging revelation came from Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor who'd known our family for 15 years. She'd been watering her garden the morning after the wedding when she overheard Mom on the phone with someone, presumably Melissa, discussing damage control for my tantrum the previous night. "Your mother was very upset," Mrs. Henderson told me gently. "Not about what happened to you, dear, but about what she called Sarah's selfishness ruining the perfect wedding photos. She was worried that your walking away had created gaps in their family portrait sessions." That detail, that their primary concern was photographic aesthetics rather than their daughter's humiliation, crystallized everything I'd learned. I wasn't a person to them. I was a prop in their family theater, valuable only as long as I played my assigned role without complaint. The phone records I requested from my wireless carrier revealed another disturbing pattern. Over the past 2 years, I'd received an average of 14 phone calls per month from family members. But when I analyzed the timing and duration, nearly all of them coincided with requests for money, labor, or logistical support. The social calls, the ones where family members checked on my well-being or shared news without asking for favors, numbered less than 6 in 24 months. I documented everything methodically, creating spreadsheets and timelines with the same attention to detail I'd used for military intelligence reports. The pattern that emerged was devastating in its consistency. Every holiday, every family celebration, every milestone event has been structured around extracting maximum value from my resources while minimizing my actual participation as a family member. The wedding had simply been the culmination of a long-running campaign to position me as the family's unpaid service provider. The valet work wasn't an emergency request. It was the logical endpoint of years of conditioning designed to make me accept servant status as normal. Most painful was discovering the group text thread that Maria's tech-savvy teenage son had helped me recover from Melissa's accidentally forwarded messages. The thread, titled Wedding Planning Squad, included Mom, Melissa, Aunt Linda, and 3 of Melissa's bridesmaids. The messages spanning 6 months revealed detailed discussions about how to manipulate me into providing free wedding services. "Sarah's military guilt complex is perfect for this," one message from Melissa read. "Tell her it's about family honor and she'll do anything." Mom's response was equally calculated. "Just frame it as a leadership opportunity. Military people love feeling important." The thread continued with strategies for leveraging my sense of duty, my financial stability compared to other family members, and my documented difficulty saying no to family requests. They'd analyzed my psychology like intelligence officers studying an enemy target, identifying vulnerabilities to exploit for maximum compliance. Reading those messages, I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, exactly, but something deeper and more structural. The family I'd believed in, the connections I'd prioritized over my own comfort and advancement, had never actually existed. In their place was a carefully constructed illusion designed to extract value while providing the minimum emotional return necessary to maintain my cooperation. The cruelest revelation was a message from Melissa sent just hours before the wedding. "Sarah's finally figured out her place in this family. About time she started contributing something useful instead of just taking up space with her war stories." I screenshotted everything, backed up the files, and printed hard copies of the most damaging conversations. Then I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by evidence of my family's calculated betrayal, and began planning my response with the same strategic precision they'd used against me. The opportunity for my strategic response came sooner than expected. 3 days after the wedding, I received a phone call from Judge Phillips's assistant, informing me that His Honor wanted to discuss the incident at Grandview Estate. Apparently, walking away with his car keys had created more of a stir than I'd anticipated. When I arrived at his chambers Thursday afternoon, I brought a leather portfolio that looked professional enough for a military briefing. Judge Phillips sat behind his mahogany desk like a king holding court, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "Miss Rodriguez," he began, his voice carrying the same condescending tone he'd used at the wedding. "I understand there was some confusion about my vehicle Saturday evening. My insurance company requires documentation of any irregularities involving Rolls-Royce." "There was no confusion, Your Honor," I replied, setting my portfolio on his desk. "But there was definitely an irregularity. Would you like to review the evidence?" His eyebrows raised slightly as I opened the portfolio, revealing the printed screenshots, transcripts, and timeline I'd meticulously prepared. "This documents the systematic exploitation of military veterans by civilian families for unpaid labor services," I said, my voice maintaining the respectful but firm tone I'd used for military briefings. "It might interest you to know that this case study involves your golf partner and his family." I watched his face change as he read through the evidence. The text messages planning my manipulation, the recorded conversation about using my soldier mentality for free services, the detailed timeline showing years of financial and labor exploitation. Judge Phillips had built his career on reading people and evidence, and what lay before him painted an unmistakable picture of calculated abuse. "Your Honor," I continued, When you lectured me about responsibility while I was working unpaid security at my sister's wedding, you were participating in veteran exploitation whether you realized it or not. These documents show that my family systematically used my military training, my sense of duty, and my financial resources for their personal benefit, while publicly treating me as hired help. The silence stretched between us as he continued reading. When he reached the screenshots of Melissa's text messages about my war stories taking up space, his jaw tightened visibly. Judge Phillips had 3 sons, 2 of whom had served in Iraq, and I could see the moment when my family's casual dismissal of military service shifted from abstract concept to personal affront. "Miss Rodriguez," he said finally, his voice much quieter than before, "I owe you an apology. What I said Saturday night was inappropriate under any circumstances, but given this context," he gestured at the documents, "I'm deeply ashamed of my words and actions." "Thank you, Your Honor. The apology means more than you know." He studied me for a long moment, then asked, "What do you intend to do with this information?" I had been hoping he would ask exactly that question. "I'm planning to present it at this Sunday's family gathering. My parents have called a meeting to discuss my behavior at the wedding. I thought they might benefit from seeing the full picture of whose behavior actually needs addressing." Judge Phillips leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Miss Rodriguez, if you ever decide to pursue law school, I'd be happy to provide a recommendation. This is some of the most thorough case preparation I've seen outside of my courtroom." Sunday's family meeting was held at my parents' house on Maple Street, in the same living room where I'd announced my decision to join the Army 11 years earlier. The familiar surroundings felt different now. Smaller, somehow, and less intimidating than they had in my memory. I arrived precisely on time, carrying the same leather portfolio I'd brought to Judge Phillips's chambers. Mom had arranged the seating like a tribunal, with herself and Dad on the couch facing a single chair clearly designated for me. Melissa sat in Dad's recliner, still wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose perfect wedding had concluded successfully despite minor disruptions. Uncle Pete lounged near the window, apparently serving as backup support for whatever intervention they'd planned. "Sarah," Mom began, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone addressing a difficult child, "we need to discuss what happened Saturday night. Your behavior was completely unacceptable, and we think you owe several people apologies." "I agree that apologies are needed," I replied, settling into the designated chair with my portfolio balanced on my knees. "But I think we should start by reviewing exactly what happened and why." I opened the portfolio and began distributing copies of the evidence I'd compiled: screenshots, transcripts, timelines, and financial records stretching back 3 years. The room fell silent as each family member received their personal copy of the documentation, their faces changing as they recognized their own words reflected back at them. "This is a comprehensive analysis of family exploitation patterns," I announced, using the same briefing tone I'd perfected during intelligence presentations. "It documents systematic manipulation of military personnel for unpaid civilian services, along with financial exploitation totaling approximately $12,000 over the past 36 months. Dad's face drained of color as he reached the page showing his recorded conversation about using my soldier mentality for free labor. Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she read her own text messages dismissing my military service as war stories taking up space. Uncle Pete stopped lounging and sat up straight when he saw his words about my being too loyal to question orders, highlighted in yellow. "This can't be legal," Mom said weakly, holding up the screenshots, "recording private conversations, accessing personal messages. Everything here was obtained through legal means," I replied calmly. Maria recorded Uncle Pete's conversation at a party where no expectation of privacy existed. The text messages were forwarded to me accidentally by Melissa herself. The phone records are my own account data, which I'm entitled to review. The silence that followed was different from any quiet I'd experienced in this house before. It wasn't the tense silence of family arguments or the expectant quiet before announcements. It was the profound stillness that follows the moment when carefully constructed lies finally collapse under the weight of documented truth. The unexpected ally arrived Tuesday morning in the form of Oliver, Melissa's new husband, standing outside my apartment building with a manila envelope clutched in his hands and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept much since the wedding. When I opened the door, he looked like a man who discovered his lottery ticket was counterfeit, deflated, embarrassed, and carrying the weight of uncomfortable revelations. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lacking the confident charm he'd displayed throughout the wedding festivities. "I found some things after we got back from our honeymoon that I think you should see. Things that make me sick to my stomach." I invited him in, noting how he avoided eye contact as he settled onto my couch. The Oliver I'd known during their courtship had been confident to the point of arrogance, a successful investment banker who spoke about market trends with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important. This version looked haunted, diminished by whatever knowledge he carried in that envelope. "I was looking for our marriage certificate to make copies for insurance purposes," he began, opening the envelope with shaking hands. Melissa had organized all our wedding documents in a binder, and I found this section I'd never seen before. He pulled out a thick stack of papers, each one carefully labeled and dated. "She kept records, Sarah. Detailed records of everything." The first document was a budget spreadsheet titled "Wedding Contributions by Source," with my name appearing in multiple categories. According to Melissa's meticulous documentation, I had contributed $3,200 toward venue costs, $800 for photography, $650 for her bridal shower, and $1,100 in various emergency payments for last-minute expenses. The total financial contribution from Sarah Sucker was $5,750, more than half of what Oliver himself had contributed to the wedding. "I had no idea," he said quietly, pointing to the notation beside my name. "She told me you'd offered to help with small things because you felt guilty about missing family events due to military deployment. She never mentioned that you were basically co-funding our wedding." The next document was even more damaging. A detailed timeline of Sarah management strategies that read like a psychological warfare manual. It outlined specific techniques for manipulating my sense of family duty, leveraging my military conditioning for compliance, and exploiting my financial stability for wedding expenses. Each strategy was accompanied by notes about its effectiveness and suggestions for future implementation. "Look at this one," Oliver said, his voice thick with disgust as he pointed to an entry dated 6 months before the wedding. Melissa wrote, "Convinced Sarah to handle security/parking by framing it as a leadership opportunity. Military people respond well to feeling important. Success rate, 100%. But it was the final section that made my hands clench into fists. Titled Post-Wedding Damage Control, it contained contingency plans for managing my potential reactions to being treated as hired help. One scenario labeled Sarah's Tantrum Protocol outlined steps for redirecting blame, garnering family sympathy, and isolating me from potential allies who might validate my grievances. She actually wrote out talking points," Oliver continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Scripts for making you look unstable if you complained about the wedding arrangements." She called it Managing Sarah's Veteran Drama for Optimal Family Harmony. The document included detailed character assessments of every family member, noting their likelihood to support me versus maintaining the status quo. Mom was rated as 100% loyal to Melissa, will gaslight Sarah effectively. Dad was listed as, quote, conflict avoidant, will support whoever makes the least noise. Even extended family members were categorized by their potential usefulness in discrediting my version of events. "There's more," Oliver said, pulling out copies of bank statements. "I found these when I was organizing our joint finances. She's been systematically documenting every favor, every loan, every contribution you've made to family members over the past 5 years. Not to track debts owed to you, but to calculate exactly how much financial leverage they had over you." The spreadsheet was titled Sarah's Guilt Portfolio and contained detailed records of money I'd lent to various family members during emergencies, none of which had ever been repaid. The total came to $18,400, but more disturbing were Melissa's annotations about using these unreturned loans as emotional weapons during family conflicts. She wrote strategy notes about how to make you feel guilty for asking for repayment. Oliver explained, his voice barely above a whisper. She actually practiced phrases designed to make you feel selfish for mentioning money you'd loaned to family members. The final document in the stack was a letter Melissa had written but never sent, addressed to me and dated 3 days after the wedding. In it, she outlined her plan to gradually exclude me from future family events while maintaining plausible deniability. The letter detailed strategies for making me feel unwelcome at gatherings, redirecting family sympathy away from me, and positioning herself as the victim of my increasing instability and military-related behavioral problems. "I married a sociopath," Oliver said flatly, staring at the papers scattered across my coffee table. "This isn't just family dysfunction, Sarah. This is systematic psychological abuse documented like a business plan." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I confronted her about this yesterday. She admitted everything, and then tried to convince me that this kind of family management was normal and necessary. I recorded the conversation because I knew no one would believe how casually she talked about manipulating you." The recording was 15 minutes of Melissa's voice explaining her strategies with the detached professionalism of someone discussing quarterly earnings reports. She showed no remorse, no recognition that her actions constituted abuse. Instead, she seemed proud of her psychological manipulation skills and frustrated that I'd finally stopped cooperating with her schemes. "She's already started phase 2, Oliver said quietly. "She's been calling family members, telling them you've been making threats against her, that your military PTSD is making you dangerous and unpredictable. She's building a case to have you excluded from family events permanently." The betrayal was so complete, so meticulously planned and executed, that I felt something fundamental shift inside my understanding of reality. This wasn't family conflict or sibling rivalry. This was predatory behavior disguised as family dynamics, and it had been happening for years without my recognition. Oliver stood up slowly, gathering the documents with hands that still trembled slightly. "I'm filing for an annulment," he said quietly. "I can't be married to someone capable of this level of calculated cruelty. And Sarah, I'll testify about any of this if you need witnesses. What she did to you isn't just wrong, it's evil." The legal documentation arrived the following morning via certified mail, thick envelopes bearing the letterhead of 3 different law firms. I spread them across my kitchen table while my coffee grew cold, reading through restraining order applications, harassment claims, and a formal complaint filed with my employer's HR department, alleging that I had made threatening contact with a former client's family member. Melissa had moved faster than I'd anticipated. According to the paperwork, I had supposedly called her 17 times in 2 days, sent disturbing messages to family members, and showed up at her workplace making vague threats about consequences. The documentation looked official and convincing, complete with timestamps and witness statements from family members I hadn't spoken to in months. My phone rang as I was reviewing the false police report, claiming I'd violated some non-existent restraining order. The caller ID showed my supervisor's number. "Rodriguez, we need you in the office immediately," Captain Morrison said without preamble. "There's been a complaint about your conduct that requires immediate investigation." At the security firm's headquarters, I sat across from Morrison and the company's legal counsel, while they reviewed allegations that I'd used company resources to harass civilian family members. The complaint, filed by someone identifying themselves as, quote, "concerned family representative," claimed I'd threatened to use my security clearance and military connections to retaliate against wedding guests who had witnessed my unstable behavior. "These are serious allegations, Rodriguez," Morrison said, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Corporations take any misuse of company resources very seriously, especially when it involves threats against civilians." I opened my laptop and accessed the files I'd prepared for exactly this scenario. "Captain, I'd like to present counter-evidence suggesting these complaints are part of a coordinated harassment campaign designed to discredit me professionally." I handed him copies of Oliver's documentation and the recorded conversation where Melissa outlined her strategy for portraying me as mentally unstable. The legal counsel's eyebrows raised as she reviewed the evidence. "This is quite sophisticated," she murmured, scanning Melissa's written plans for destroying my reputation. "Your sister actually documented her intention to file false complaints against you?" "She documented everything," I replied. including her strategy for isolating me from family support systems and damaging my professional reputation through false allegations of misconduct. Morrison's expression darkened as he reached the section where Melissa had researched my employer's disciplinary procedures and identified which types of complaints would trigger immediate suspension. "She knows our internal protocols," he observed grimly. "This wasn't random harassment, this was targeted professional sabotage." The turning point came when I played Oliver's recording of Melissa admitting to her manipulation strategies. Her voice filled the conference room, casual and confident, as she explained how she'd, quote, neutralized Sarah's ability to cause problems through systematic reputation destruction. "I've been documenting her behavior patterns for years," Melissa's recorded voice explained to Oliver. "Military people are easy to discredit because everyone expects them to be unstable anyway. A few well-placed complaints about threatening behavior, some concerned calls to her employer, and suddenly nobody takes her seriously anymore." Morrison stopped the recording and sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed something genuinely disgusting. "Rodriguez, not only are these complaints against you dismissed, but I'm recommending you for our company's integrity commendation. This level of psychological warfare, it's disturbing." The legal counsel was already making notes about potential criminal charges for filing false police reports and workplace harassment. "Ms. Rodriguez, you should consider consulting with a personal attorney about pursuing charges for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. This documentation provides overwhelming evidence of malicious conduct." By afternoon, the tide had turned completely. Oliver had provided sworn testimony about Melissa's documented plans for my professional destruction. Judge Phillips had written a letter to my employer's executive team describing the wedding incident and my exemplary character. 3 family members who had initially supported Melissa's version of events called to retract their statements after seeing the evidence of her manipulation. The most satisfying moment came when Melissa herself called, her voice tight with panic as she realized her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's been some misunderstandings about—" "There have been no misunderstandings," I interrupted calmly. "There's been systematic abuse, documentation of that abuse, and now consequences for that abuse. The only thing we need to discuss is whether you'd prefer to retract your false statements voluntarily or have them withdrawn through legal action." The silence stretched between us before she hung up without another word. Within hours, formal retractions began arriving at my employer's office, each one accompanied by apologies for misunderstandings and miscommunications that had led to the complaints. The peace that followed wasn't immediate. It was gradual, like dawn breaking after the longest night of your life. I spent the weeks after Melissa's formal retraction learning how to exist, without constantly anticipating the next attack, the next manipulation, the next crisis that would somehow become my responsibility to solve. For the first time in my adult life, my phone rang with genuine social calls rather than requests for money or labor. Larahim, Larahi, Larahim, Larahim. The boundaries I established were simple but non-negotiable. No more financial loans without written agreements and repayment schedules. No more unpaid labor disguised as family favors. No more accepting blame for other people's poor planning or unrealistic expectations. Most importantly, no more sacrificing my dignity to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Judge Phillips became an unexpected mentor, introducing me to other veterans in professional fields and recommending me for leadership positions within the legal community's veteran support networks. The man who had humiliated me at the wedding became one of my strongest advocates, proving that people can change when confronted with the truth about their actions. Oliver's annulment proceedings revealed additional evidence of Melissa's manipulative behavior toward multiple people, not just me. Her pattern of psychological exploitation had extended to friends, co-workers, and even romantic partners throughout her adult life. The marriage lasted exactly 6 weeks before the legal dissolution was finalized. My relationship with my parents evolved into something resembling cordial acquaintance. They never apologized directly, but they stopped making requests for my services and began treating me with the careful respect people show when they know they've lost moral authority. Our interactions became brief, polite, and emotionally neutral. Exactly what I needed to heal from decades of exploitation. The most profound change was internal. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped minimizing my achievements to make others comfortable, stopped accepting less than I deserved simply to avoid conflict. Military service had taught me to value honor, courage, and integrity, but civilian family life had taught me to compromise those values for the illusion of belonging. Now I know the difference between family and blood relatives, between love and manipulation, between healthy compromise and self-destruction. Real family doesn't require you to diminish yourself to prove your worth. Real love doesn't demand sacrifice without reciprocity. Real relationships don't need extensive documentation to prove their authenticity. When people ask me about that night at the wedding, about driving away in Judge Phillips's Rolls-Royce while my sister screamed behind me, I tell them it wasn't about the car or the valet job or even the public humiliation. It was about finally choosing myself after 28 years of choosing everyone else. It was about recognizing that loyalty without respect isn't family, it's servitude. I kept that red valet jacket as a reminder. It hangs in my closet next to my dress blues, a symbol of the night I stopped being useful and started being free. 6 months later, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud. Melissa was getting remarried. Apparently, Oliver's annulment had freed her to pursue her backup plan, a divorced real estate developer with 2 teenage kids and a reputation for lavish spending. The wedding invitation was addressed to Ms. Sarah Rodriguez and guest, with a handwritten note in Mom's careful script. "We hope you can attend as a family." I RSVP'd with a simple response. "Thank you for the invitation. I'll be attending as a guest who pays for her own parking." The wedding was smaller this time, held at a modest venue with significantly fewer luxury cars in the parking lot. I arrived in my dress blues again, but this time I wore them with pride rather than resignation. Judge Phillips was there. Apparently his friendship with Dad had survived the revelations, and he greeted me with genuine warmth and respect. When Melissa walked down the aisle, she looked beautiful, but somehow diminished, like a copy of a copy that had lost some essential detail in translation. Her new husband seemed nice enough, though I caught him glancing nervously at his phone throughout the ceremony, as if expecting bad news. I stayed for exactly 1 hour, long enough to congratulate the couple and demonstrate that I held no grudges. As I prepared to leave, Mom approached with tears in her eyes. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I know we can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become." It wasn't the apology I'd once craved, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the family member who gives everything and gets taken for granted, drop a comment below. Share your own experience. I read every single one, and your stories matter. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about finding your voice, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to choose them. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be useful and decide to be valued instead. What's your story? I'm listening.